Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are around this fine world. We're here again with WOWSA Live and our special series called the ICE series. I'm here with a co-host, Ram Barkai from Cape Town, and also Professor Greg Whyte, and also Professor Dr. Heather Berlin. Welcome, everybody.
Hiya.
Yeah.
Hi.
Now, it was quite interesting how these three individuals actually met, and it had to do with a man called Stan Lee. Ram, could you sort of explain your relationship between Greg, Heather, and you?
I got somehow asked to participate in one of these Superhuman Showdown TV series where they take superhumans from around the world and test them in the sort of area of superhumanity, and then have a challenge, and then the top finals meet up in a studio in London, and each one of these. So Heather was my supervisor, or my. She looked after me. Greg looked after someone else, and we all end up in the studio where we all had to perform some magic. And Heather, Greg, and Raul were the panel of judges. So they've done actually the entire series. I don't know how many episodes were there. Do you remember, Greg?
Difficult to remember, actually. Because I mean, the great thing about the show is we flew around the world. It was a great gig to have. We flew around the world meeting various superhumans. So obviously Ram for ice swimming, but I was with Spider-Man for free climbing, and Tiger Power. Do you remember Tiger Power? For his superhuman strength. And I mean, it was a great show. And then we came back to the studio, and it was cut into for Discovery. It was cut into 4 episodes, or was it 6 episodes, Helen?
I feel like it might have been 5 episodes.
I think you're right.
Episodes. Yeah, 5 1-hour episodes.
It was great fun. It was great fun, and it was enlightening. Absolutely enlightening.
Yeah.
Now, Heather, when you met Ram, you were actually meeting him in some fort up in Norway, and he scared you. Why did he scare you?
Yes, he did. It was not his personality that scared me, but he went into break a record, I believe it was, in the length of time he was swimming in this ice water, and we had him swallow this pill that had a thermometer in it, so I could externally measure his core body temperature while he was in the water. And I think he did like a 22-minute swim in this ice water, and he was able to maintain his body temperature the whole time, which was really amazing. And we can get into that, and why we thought how he could do that. But whatever thing that he was doing in the water, when he came out of the water and he broke his concentration, that's when his body temperature dropped. And he had a system where we had to take him to this very nearby lodge that would have a shower, and then would gradually heat him up with the warm water and get his body temperature back to normal, because he knew his whole physiology that it would drop after he got out of the water. The problem is when we got to the lodge, the water wasn't warm enough. It was cold. So his body temperature wasn't rising, and he was in a kind of stupor. Like most people would be unconscious at that level that he was at, but he was able to maintain consciousness, but it wasn't looking good. And I was getting very nervous because we all started scrambling to rush him in these cars to get to through the mountains, to get to the next lodge. And, I'm moderating it, like, as the host, like, so now, like, what's happening is these organs would, start to be shutting down. And I'm trying to, like, narrate what would be happening from a scientific perspective. Well, I think, oh my God, this guy might die, And we scrambled to get to the next lodge. It was really scary amount of time. And then finally we got there. Eventually he, warms up again. I remember, I think we did shots of whiskey that night to celebrate. But it was, what'd you say?
Plenty of them, yeah.
Yes, we did indeed. And it was a relief, but I was scared there for a while, and I was panicking and trying to kind of cover it up by being the host. Yeah.
Ram, I can imagine you've got the cameraman, you've got a driver, you have Heather, everybody's panicking, you're rushing, and you're cool, calm, and collected. Do you remember what was happening mentally at that point?
So interestingly enough, I remember everything. And I kind of remember that, I don't know, typical Israeli background me, even semi-conscious, I was still giving instructions to everyone what to do.
Yes, that's true.
Because we went up in Folgafonna, which is like probably one of the largest glacier in Norway, to find the glacial water. And it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And we found a lake, and it was a lot of work. The farmers had to bring a tractor, if you remember, to break the ice. And as I was swimming, I had a boat in front of me, sort of moving, floating ice, because it was quite a lot. And the one behind me with a rope attached to my waist in case they need to fish me out. So it was quite a challenging swim where I had to do a lot of sighting because I swam into ice all the time, big thingy of ice. And we did circle in these dams, and sometimes I had to stop and shift like a big sheet of ice out of my wave and carry on swimming. So I think I swam, I don't know, about 22 minutes. And then I could feel that I'm struggling with, I can't really move the ice anymore. You know, it's more, I still need to focus on swimming. I said, let's get out. We got out, we got into the car. I was fine. And then the after drop started. We got into the shower in the lodge, and there was no hot water. And I knew exactly what's coming my way. I think everyone else had no idea what's coming my way. I knew exactly what's coming my way. And I started giving orders kind of, okay, we need to find a warm place quickly. Get me into the car with the heaters on. And I got into the car. And it's a very little, if Heather remember, a very little mountain path with snow all around it. And suddenly we got to another place, and they stuck me into the shower. And my core body temperature, I told them to read the core body temperature to me all the time. And I was standing in the shower, and I remember, I can't remember who was that. I think it was Heather. Okay. When I finished the swim, when I swallowed the capsule, might interest you, Greg, my core body temperature was 36.4. When I was about to start the swim, my core body temperature was just over 38. Spoke about it yesterday. When I finished the swim, my core body temperature was 35.4. And in the shower, my core body temperature started to go down, 34, 33. When it got to 30, everyone was starting to panic. And then I started to come back. And so I was a little bit dizzy in the shower. Wasn't exactly sure where I was, but I was standing all the time. And when I got out of the shower and I said, okay, I had enough, I'm fine, my core body temperature was 33. Greg, that's related to a question that I would like to ask you later. So if you remember that.
Yeah.
But let me
I
just
think it was fine. I don't know.
Let me take a caveat from an outside observer. His speech was slurred. We had to hold him up. It wasn't just, you couldn't really walk on your own. We had to sort of carry you to assist you to the car. You were not, your body functions were way, deteriorated from a normal waking state. And we were most frankly surprised that you had remained conscious. And you had said after, when you finally recovered, that part of why your whole system didn't crash is that you were able to, you knew it was so important to maintain consciousness throughout that, or else if you allowed yourself to kind of pass out, then everything would actually crash. So there was something you were doing to maintain that, but you were in a very compromised state from an outside perspective. Yeah.
So what's remarkable, I followed Ram when he did the first ice mile. It was in Lake Zurich. You and Andrew Chin, if you remember.
Yes.
And since that time, we've had over 600 ice miles. So Ram has done, I think, 11 or 12. And we've seen, and this question is directed to you, Greg, we've seen Ram sort of set the standard of this ice mile, this swimming under 5 degrees Celsius for a mile in length, 1.6 kilometers. And now at the time he did it, it was unfathomable. How could a human do this? And now suddenly, 8 years later, we have over 600 people around the world and growing every year. My question to you is, once someone sets a standard and then somebody else breaks that record, and again and again and again, where do you see some limit to human potential?
Well, do you know what? Let me give you another great example of that, and that because it's UK based, and that is Roger Bannister when he broke the 4-minute mile back in 1954. And at that time, the greatest athletes on the planet were trying to break 4 minutes for the mile, and they got closer and closer and closer, but could never do it. And on this, what can only describe as a very dreary night at what's called Iffley Road Stadium, just down the road from me in Oxford, Roger Bannister broke the world record. Now, at that time, guys like me and guys like Heather said publicly that if a man ran below 4 minutes for a mile, they would die. That was the believed dogma. And so this is very much akin to what Ram has achieved in terms of the ice mile. Always prior to it, it always seems impossible. And actually, that was a lovely quote coined by Nelson Mandela, is that it always seems impossible until it's been achieved. Yeah. But when you look at the 4-minute mile, that very same year, over a second and a half was taken off that 4-minute world record by exactly the same athletes who couldn't break that barrier for a very long period of time. And so what you have to think about is there are a whole host of different barriers to achieving these physical feats. But one of the key drivers is actually a psychological barrier, is that there is fundamentally a belief that it cannot be done. And so therefore what happens is that science and medicine and sociologists and all of these guys come on board to say, yeah, you're right, it cannot be done. And then all of a sudden, Ram comes along and proves everybody wrong and actually does it and doesn't die. And Roger Bannister coined it beautifully. I know Roger well. He actually forwarded one of my books. And I remember him saying to me is that he crossed the line. And when he looked at the clock and saw he'd run below 4 minutes, he assumed that he was dead because that's what he was told would happen. And so I think, what you always have to remember here is that there are psychological limits as well as physiological limits, as well as technical and tactical limits. But I think critically, the psychological thing is that the first to ever do it is incredible, without any shadow of a doubt. I mean, that's, to be the first is something very, very special. But once it's been done, the belief system in people changes and they believe that they can do it. And that then breaks down the barriers for other people. And that's why now you see others doing it.
Got it. I know in open water swimming, we often say a channel swim, a swim like Ram, et cetera, is 80% mental and 20% physical. We also say, the most important muscle in the body is between the ears. These are things that we as lay people in the open water swimming world often tell ourselves. True or not, I don't know. But since we have Heather, an expert in the brain and psychology, what do you say to those just generic statements by the open water swimmer? 80% of what we do is mental and 20% is physical.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I couldn't technically give it an accurate percentage, but I think, what they're getting at is that a very large percent of what can help us get to the edges of our capacity as humans. I think you need to have the physical prowess to be able to do it. You need to have certain things in place. But once you have that, and then you add in the practice and, repetition and the rest, it's the thing that really gets you over the edge is your mentality, is the mindset, because it enhances your motivation. And there's so many, the mind-body connection there's so much we still don't know. I believe there are mechanisms. I don't think it's magic or there's some mystical, substance. We just don't know exactly what it is just yet. there's some ideas. I mean, we've only recently found this whole lymphatic system, around the brain anatomically that for some reason we didn't know of before, so the idea of the immune system being very much connected to our brain. But so to me, that's what puts you over the edge. You need to put everything in place physically. But if you really want to break barriers, the mentality is the thing that's going to get you there. So if you want to call that 80%, call it, whatever percentage you want to put on it. Yeah. But, there are parts of our brain that are like, if you think you can't do something, you start releasing these stress hormones, and, you can then hinder the body, right? If you're having positive feelings and endorphins, you can accelerate your performance. So these are some ways where your mentality can interact with your neurophysiology and your body and your performance.
Wow. And then Greg, you were an Olympian yourself, 1992, and then subsequent to that, you saw a number of great British athletes at 5 other Olympics. What strikes me and pertinent to this conversation and the ice swimming world in particular, are these athletes are older. Like, they're not in their teens and 20s. They're not even in their 30s, although some of them are. They're in their 40s and 50s and 60s. Do you, in the same way that Heather was mentioning that, maybe, or most certainly our brain plays a big part in achieving our true potential, can our potential increase as we get older?
Okay. I mean, just going back onto the previous point, the one thing I would be very careful about is conflating performance into a single entity. What is required for elite performance is the perfect storm. It's physiological, psychological, sociological. There are so many factors that influence it. And I think often what we do is actually it's the disease of the unsuccessful to pin it onto a single factor. So they'll say, oh, you're lucky. Oh, you come from a wealthy background. Oh, you're just talented at birth. Oh, you're strong in the mind. And it makes it easier to cope for people who can't do those things. I think the bottom line is that the brain is fundamental to elite performance. And when I talk about ice miles, I coin that within that elite performance sphere. But what you can't do is simply isolate that. You have to remember how long it takes. I mean, Ram didn't turn up to his first ice swim and swim a mile. There is a huge background of incredibly hard work and an experience which enables him to get to that point of being able to swim a mile. As anybody who's ever swum an ice mile will understand, it's not your first swim. So I think that's a really important factor. I think the interesting thing about age is that I think what we do in society, there is a dogma which is pervasive, that once we get past the age of 40, we're on the scrap heap of life. It's all over. You can't do anything. You can't perform. And I think if you look at all sports now globally, what you see is the dramatic rise in the past decade or so of age group sport. So you take a look at swimming, triathlon, track and field, and the list goes on, where what we are now seeing is incredible performances from older athletes. I was at the World Swimming Championships 2 years ago now, and I watched the 50-meter freestyle. And in the heat, 8 swimmers in the heat, the average age was 86. I mean, it was, and they dived in. I mean, it was inspiring to watch. So I think the interesting thing is that we can achieve beyond the age of 30. There's no doubt about it that peak performance, because of a whole host of physiological factors, generally tends to occur at an earlier age. Now, it is sport specific. I mean, you take gymnastics, female gymnasts are in their teens, early 20s. Male gymnasts maybe go a little bit longer because strength is an important factor within that. Equally, if you take a look at endurance sport, then actually endurance athletes tend to go longer. Of course, if you add on top of that, what we're now able to do is look after, our knowledge is much better. We're able to look after athletes much better. So what we do is we have created a longevity. So, in the US, you take a look at pro ball in the US, and you now see players into their 30s in the pro arena. And that's because we've actually been able to look after them better so they can actually continue to perform better. So there is fundamentally this perfect storm of multiple factors which come together to allow athletes to compete at the highest level, and now to do that with legacy into the longer term, into the 40s, into the 50s.
Thank you. Ram, you had a question for Heather?
It's probably to both. You know, when you try to break barrier and succeed in sports, like Heather said, you have to have a positive mindset, specifically if you want to, you can't go to the Olympic game thinking, ooh, I might not make it, okay? You're not gonna make it if you don't have that mindset. Ice swimming is a slightly different sport in the sense that it's not just about how fast I can swim or how fast I can run. There is like other extreme sport, there's a huge element of extreme. Being positive or over positive can conflict with being very rational with the risks that you take. So I'm very interested in how does one mentally, I can tell you what I do, but there are people that are definitely already much better than me. How can one train to succeed in extreme sport mentally? Like, is there any, we know so much about the nuances of the physical, you know, we've got so many drills in the pool and so many techniques, whatever. How do we train mentally if, especially in extreme sport, when we believe that 80% of the success is mental? And I'll throw the ball at Heather and can throw it to Greg.
So I think and Greg can speak to this, you know, I think it's going to depend on what the sport, you know, if it's an endurance sport, if it's a, you know, depending on what the sport is, maybe slightly different techniques, but I can tell you in general, and I think this applies just not to sports, but to how we live our lives, you know, is that if you can, first of all, decreasing anxiety, right? What do elite athletes have in common? That they're not cracking under pressure, right? So how do you stay the peak level of motivation, not overly where you get too much activation or arousal, and then that can be disadvantageous. And you don't want too little arousal either, right? You want just sort of this peak level of arousal. And so how do you kind of modulate that if, you know, decreasing anxiety to the point where you're still motivated, but not stressed? Or getting into these flow states, which I'm really interested in. So when you kind of, in some ways, are so engaged in the task at hand and so present in the moment, in some ways you lose your sense of self. And we can help people get into these mind states where you have decreased anxiety or senses of fear or even decreased pain thresholds, right? So you go in this ice water, it's painful. You have to be able to overcome that pain as well as be motivated to keep going. And so certain types of meditation can help people. So I would say outside, off the field or wherever you're training, you know, practicing mindfulness based techniques, breathing techniques, meditation to allow your mind to get into these flow states, even doing creative endeavors, you know, painting or you know, doing other forms of exercise, but places where you feel you lose your sense of self and time and place, and your mind is in a very relaxed state. I think that will be really helpful carrying forward to when you're in this very extreme state, how to keep your mind calm.
Got it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I guess to some extent what we're talking about is mental strength. Mm-hmm. And I think some people would call that mental resilience. I mean, it's been coined variously, but to some extent mental strength. And I think what's interesting is that people often, you know, they'll look at Ram and say he is mentally strong and he's always been mentally strong and he was born with that gift. And I can tell you it's absolutely not true. You know, we're not born with the gift of mental strength. What happens is through our behaviors and our actions is that we develop and improve our mental strength. And I think it comes in, I mean, psychologists often talk about it in what we call the 4 C's. So this idea of control is that it's control to some extent is underpinned by belief. And that is that what Ram has done over a period of time is that, you know, he got into the ice water on his first occasion and probably, you know, spent a minute in there. And when he got out, he knew that he could do a minute. So all of a sudden, the belief that, can I survive for a minute in ice water? Yes, I can, because I've done it. You know, evidence supports that. And so with a progressive approach, and what that underpins then is the next thing, which is commitment, and that is the creation of goal setting. So the role of goal setting and actually looking at, can I do a minute? Can I do 2 minutes? Can I do 3 minutes? Can I do 4 minutes? All the way through to that swim that you did with Heather of 22 minutes. And so that goal setting and achieving those short-term goals then drives the belief, which further drives the commitment. And then, of course, challenge comes on the top of that. Is that part of that process is challenging yourself to demonstrate what you can achieve and what is achievable. And then finally, effectively, what all of that drives then is confidence, which is fundamentally self-belief. Is that mental strength comes from that process where what we are doing is we are developing that mental strength to the point where we can predict the outcome based upon the experiences that we have had, and therefore we then acting in a certain behavior to bring about that certain outcome. So I think it's an interesting one. This idea that somehow, well, you've either got the right mentality or you haven't is entirely untrue. It can be trained.
Thank you. Greg, you mentioned the 4 C's, the control, the commitment, the challenge, and the confidence. What I've seen in the ice swimming world is one more C. Yeah. And I'd like you both to comment on this. And that's community, meaning, you know, Ram goes to these events either with you two and a team, or he goes to, you know, England and swims in the Lido or someplace, and all these people gather, and I just feel the ambiance, this energy amongst all these like-minded people, and it seems that it just sort of rises. Everybody seems rises, and you've been at the Olympics, and you get all these great athletes from around the world, and all of a sudden you get a truly Olympian effort. What is the effect of having like-minded people around you with that same level of control and commitment, challenge, and confidence?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because Heather's sort of just spoken to that. I think there's an interesting thing in psychology called the catastrophe theory, is that when we are challenged, is that effectively with anxiety, stress can be very, very positive. And so when we're at the Olympic Games, or when we're about to take on our first ice mile, there is an awful lot of stress, an awful lot of anxiety. But with that stress, what then comes is an enhancement in performance. And that enhancement in performance, particularly on a community basis, driven by things that Heather has spoken to, things like dopamine, which raise the game. And so therefore performance starts to rise. But there is a point at which where, and we sometimes talk about an inverted U, or a good friend of mine who's a specialist in this area talks about catastrophe theory, is that all of a sudden you get to the point where the stress and anxiety and pressure is so high that effectively you just drop off a cliff. Performance goes out the window. And we see that in elite athletes constantly, where they just implode during performances. And so to some extent, what you're trying to do is balance that. Stress is good. Too much stress is bad. And so what you're trying to do is optimize that. And I think what happens when it comes to community-based, you know, when you go to a competition, when you're with other people, is that to some extent what you do is you feed off that, and it helps you to balance that stress. You're in an environment where you can actually interact with other people with experience, people with knowledge, people who have done it before. And what that enables you to do is balance that stress much better, and therefore enhance your performance.
And just to add to that, so the theory that I think both Greg and I have been alluding to is this Yerkes-Dodson law, which basically talks about the optimum level of arousal. You don't want to have too little arousal, but you also don't want too much. You want that optimal level. And so Greg, I think what you're saying is, like, if you have the positive impact of the social environment, that can help lower you down a bit to get into that optimal range. Absolutely. And then I think there's another theory in psychology, this called the social facilitation effect. And they find this, like, even in cockroaches who are like running, they'll run a little faster if there are other cockroaches watching them, you know? And so, I mean, there's also, so depending on what the task is, sometimes people watching you can enhance your performance. If the task is really sort of cognitively demanding, then you actually get the opposite effect where you can, it actually can inhibit your performance. That's a social inhibition effect. But I think that, you know, in this context of sports, also having a positive kind of competition, right? The competition of which motivates you, right? Maybe it's a friendly environment, but you kind of want to beat the guy, you know, you want to get a better score than the guy next to you. Even if you're not directly competing, you're kind of, it ups the ante, ups the game a little bit. Like normally, if you're just alone, you're competing against yourself. Now you have others, which can motivate you even more. So I think all that is probably in the mix.
Got it.
So if I can, it's an interesting question. So Steve, if I can answer it as well. Two elements of that. I think the first one that you spoke about, the mindset. Before I go to specifically iSmile, ice kilometers slightly less because like Greg said, you know, I've done it relatively so many times that unless it's below zero and conditions around are very scary, I've done it. I know I can do it. I feel I can do it. I know it's going to be painful and it's going to be 15, 16, 17, 18 minutes, depends on the condition I'm out. iSmile is slightly different because of the length, it can stretch to over 30 minutes and it takes me with my body mass to different places. So I don't like people, and Heather, you might remember that I even ask people, don't ask me any questions in the last sort of 5 minutes or whatever, 10 minutes before I go swim. You can talk to me, you can guide me, you can help me. Don't ask me questions that force me to start focusing out of my sort of bubble that I'm creating. And before I start an iSmile, it happened to me a few times, already people around me talking too fast. I've slowed down, I'm zoomed in or zoned into a place that I actually can selectively block noise from the outside. I don't use music to do that, actually. I like to almost close my eyes and I can do it without music. And I don't like people interrupting me. And it takes me to a place that what Heather, probably what you're describing, where I'm very anxious, but I'm comfortable with it and I'm ready for that. The community part, I think ice swimming is a different sport in the sense that, especially when a lot of people swimming, the concentration of risk is compounded. And for me, the community, aside from the camaraderie and especially after the swim, when we all get our massive endorphin kick, is safety. Because I know that I can push myself as far as the safety sort of ring around me. It's unlike many other sports that I'll run until I fall down and pass out, or basically in the ice, things happens very quickly. And for me, looking around and knowing the community who looks after me, knowing where everything else, that everything allows me to switch off and push myself even further, because I know other people going to make sure that I'm safe, which is probably, I always use the analogy for these mega massive wave surfing, that the guys just go down these 100-foot waves, and they can only do that because there's a whole system around to get them out when things go wrong, and things go wrong.
And now I have a different kind of question, and this is whether there exists a difference between males and females, not anatomically, not physiologically, but in this either creation of a flow state or, you know, upping of their mental game. Are there any differences, Heather and Greg, that you see that either women prepare faster, better, quicker, or men prepare faster, better, quicker, or differently to do anything extreme, and specifically open water swimming, but it could be anything. It could be a marathon. It could be preparing for a major job interview.
I mean, women are obviously better, but no.
I was about to say that. I was going to say
You were going to say that? I beat you to it because we're better.
There you go. You see, you beat me.
We're right on it. I mean, I think, there is definitely something about pain and endurance, and that we know physiologically from women being prepared for childbirth, that I think there's been studies which show that pain endurance, women can have a higher threshold for that. I don't know how it translates though into these, into different sports. Obviously there's body differences, so there are different categories in terms of, competing, but in terms of the mentality, I don't know that, that there, at least for my work, when looking at these flow states, there doesn't seem to be male-female differences. There are differences in personality types. People who are more neurotic, it's harder to get into these flow states. They have too much prefrontal cortex activation, and it's hard to kind of turn it down. But I don't see many male-female differences when it comes to that.
Got it. Greg, and
yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. I think you see as many differences within gender as you do across gender. So I think there are some outstanding women, there are some outstanding men. Equally, there are some very weak performances in both genders. I think that perhaps the interesting factor here is the interesting thing for me about things like ice swimming is that it has come at a time when there was no gender differential. So women competed alongside men at the same time. There was no barriers to entry. So, I mean, you mentioned the marathon. I mean, just to put that into context, the first women's Olympic marathon was in 1984. They had to wait until 1984 before they were allowed to run a marathon. And that's because the male misogynists who controlled athletics believed that it would irreparably damage their reproductive organs if they ran too far. And if you think the first 1,500 meters for women was 1972. So, what I think what's interesting about the progression of other sports is that women took a much longer period of time to actually break down those barriers to compete. I think the interesting thing about ice mile is that effectively from day one, women have been doing ice miles just as men have. So it's always an intriguing one to say, is there a difference between the two? I think experience and longevity of participation does make a big difference.
Yeah. And now I have another related question, but this is when an athlete, male or female, elite, average, you name it, they achieve their goal. They cross the English Channel, they do an ice mile, or they, I don't know, become an executive of their firm or what have you. They get a PhD. I often see it, especially in the swimming world, that they achieve what their life's goal is, and then suddenly there's a depression of some sort, or there's a stagnation. Is that a valid observation? And two, how do you overcome that? How can we minimize it? Heather?
Yeah, so I would say, well, a lot of times people who are motivated to achieve these goals, they often, once they achieve them, will then set another goal and another one and another one. They never are like, well, now I'm done, right? It's always like, okay, I won the world championship. Can I win 2 of them? Can I win 3? And so there's that mentality. But there are some where once they achieve this sort of ultimate thing, and maybe they think, I was at my peak and I might not be able to do that again, or, I don't have another, Olympic gold medal in me. I have seen that there can be a depression. I spoke with Lindsey Vonn, who is an Olympic skier champion, and she had clinical depression. And we spoke about it, and she said she missed that adrenaline rush that she would get. There was nothing like those, competing in those Olympic Games. And until she found recently now she's hosting a TV show, and now she gets that same rush. It's live, you can't make a mistake. It's, everyone's watching you. And she found that has helped satisfy that. And, I also spoke to Buzz Aldrin, who, was one of the first men